welcome back. And we're moving into our first conversation for today. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. We're joined by representatives of the reconstituted Belize National Indigenous Council. We have with us on set Sebastian Caetano of the Garifuna Council. We have Felicita Antun, who is of the Northern Association of Maya Yucatec. We have Dr. Filiberto Penados, who is the interim chair of the council. And on the end, we have Pablo, who is from the Maya Leaders Alliance and representing the Toledo Alcaldes Association. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
I guess we need to get it in each language. Let's start with the... And then Keji? All right, there we go. So, we were asking some of the preliminary questions before we get started, and I hope we can cover all of them again, because this is very fascinating to see the indigenous groups in Belize coming together in this amalgamated council. And my first question is, why now?
Fantastic question. It's a good point to start. Why Belize National Indigenous Council? I was mentioning just before we started that the Belize National Indigenous Council was actually established around the early mid-90s, and it was partially in response to 1992, the celebration of 500 years of the discovery of America, that indigenous peoples and African people actually not something to celebrate. So indigenous peoples came together and said, oh, we need to think about this more carefully. So that's kind of triggered the establishment of that. Mm-hmm. But why the Belize National Indigenous Council? Well, essentially, the council is established to bring people together, indigenous peoples together, to act in a united kind of way, to strengthen that unity.
Yeah.
And to respond to indigenous reality and advance indigenous aspirations. Okay? So what is the indigenous reality and what are the aspirations?
I was going to get there. How do you classify what particular groups are indigenous? And I know the basic definition will help, but just so people can understand, for example, why is a Creole group not a part of the Indigenous Council, or an East Indian group?
Okay, fantastic question. So to begin with, I think it's very important to distinguish between indigeneity and citizenship.
Yes.
Okay. Because often people become confused by that. Okay. So if you're not indigenous, does it mean that you're not Belizean? Absolutely not. Right? Absolutely not. No. We are all Belizeans. Yeah. We are all Belizeans by virtue of having been bound together by the British, you can put it, in this territory.
Exactly.
And by sharing responsibility for taking care of this land and taking care of each other, governing ourselves. That's what we are all citizens of Belize. I think that's bottom line that needs to be understood.
Yes.
Exactly.
So when we're talking about indigeneity, we're talking about something very specific as well. Okay? You're talking, it's because indigenous, you can say, well, if you're born here, you're indigenous. And in a sense, that is true, right? If you're born there, you could say that you're indigenous in some general way.
Yeah.
But we're talking about something very specific when you're talking about indigenous peoples. And I think in the Americas, it's pretty simple. I mean, you look at around the world and it's become more complicated. But in the Americas, you're talking about peoples, obviously, who are born, can trace their ancestry back to the Americas prior to Christopher Columbus.
Exactly.
That's one. Okay, yeah. That's essentially the critical issue there. And then, so in that sense, you're talking about the Maya people, about the Garifuna people. And there are international instruments that define who indigenous peoples are legally. So, for example, the ILO Convention 169, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They have a definition of what indigenous people are.
That's right.
People who are distinct from the rest of society, who are governed partially or completely by their own cultures, who want to pass this to their future generations, as who above all identify as indigenous people.
Some people also use the classification of First Nation people. In other words, these would be the groups that were there before any colonizers came in.
Exactly.
And if we look north, we know the Native Americans, for example, in the United States is an example of an indigenous community. Now, I can recall back, and it's fairly recent too, it was early 2000s when the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was made at the United Nations. And it really, I think, was spurred out of the plight and the challenges that Indigenous people across the world have faced.
Yes.
Many
Yes.
feel as if they've been boxed out of a particular country that they're in, marginalized in some way or shape.
Yep.
In your opinion, how would you say the Indigenous community in Belize ranks compared to what others face across the globe?
Well, in the case of the Maya people, they have really serious land issues, land struggles. Even up to now, as we say, even the Garifuna people, we do have our own struggles and issues. And then our yearn is to participate actively in the development of the country. We don't want to be marginalized, set aside. No, we are Belizeans, and proud Belizeans, and we want to be part of Belize and actively participating in the development of Belize. And as such, effort, resources are to be made available for these parties to facilitate our participation.
Maybe, well, the realities are pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to go into that. But you asked how it might be, how does it compare to the rest of the world? Let me make reference to poverty assessment that was done around 2010, which is kind of around the same time that we did our poverty assessment. Was that the last one or the previous one? I can't recall. But the World Bank did an assessment of poverty and inequality in the Americas, and it describes the America and the Caribbean as the most unequal place on planet Earth.
Wow.
Okay? One. Two, it says that if you're indigenous or black, right, in Latin America and the Caribbean, you have an 80% chance of being poor.
Wow.
Right? Now, it varies from country to country. Now, if you look at poverty rate at the time in Belize, the Maya people in southern Belize reported an 80% level of poverty. Right? So in the last one, it's 67% compared to a national average of 40%. Of course, we have to be careful how we talk about poverty, right? Yeah. Because is it poor because you don't have cash? Yeah. You might have food, and poverty can be used as a weapon as well, right? So, but nonetheless, you can see how we compare.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to get back to that point because that's an important point, but I want to bring Pablo into the conversation. And I joked with you when you came on set. I said, this council, which is wonderful in being, because I can see the work in being able to preserve culture, in really educating people, but it would also make people a bit nervous as well. And I give the example of when the Mayans of the South went to court for the communal lands issue. It made a lot of people nervous, and quite frankly, many people had very derogatory things to say about who is entitled to land within particular areas. Now, we see how it panned out. We saw how it panned out in the court, and we know you're still there trying to ensure that the land titles are secured. But how do you respond to people who say, okay, well, if this group comes together and wants to stake a claim over whatever it is, what would you tell them in terms of your purpose, especially given the fact that it may make people a little bit nervous?
I think it's important to keep in mind some of the earlier comments that were made by Dr. Penados and Brother Cayetano. Essentially, if you go back and look at the motivations behind fighting for independence, it was about, we want to be able to have a space. We want to be able to have a share of the wealth of this country. We want to be able to live a dignified life. Yeah. Well, let's think about 2018 right now. And let's really consider, and let's put a check on where we are as communities, indigenous and non-indigenous communities in Belize. The plight of the Mayas and the plight of the Garufinas, I think, and the Maya Yucatecs, really is an attempt to say that in order for us to be able to stand a chance at creating a future, a dignified future, in order for us to be able to contribute to the development of Belize, a small country with so much potential, we need to be able to allow our people a space to be a part of that process. And what we're saying down south is that we cannot be a part of that process if we're landless people. What we hear the Garifuna saying is, we can't be a part of that process if we don't have access to our resources. You hear the same thing about the Yucatec communities.
Yeah.
So it should ruffle some feathers, if I could put it that way, when you hear people demanding these kinds of processes to be put in place. Ruffle some feathers in the sense that if there are things that needs to be corrected in our approach to developing our communities, then there is an obligation on us, beyond being indigenous, but as citizens of this country, to take our place and begin charting a future for our communities and for Belize.
You said that part of what motivates and what should justify the identification of indigenous people is, in the progress of Belize, is that it is part of the future development of the country. But isn't part of being indigenous about what our past was? So if you look at customary land rights, so it's not about putting satellites in Toledo. It's about keeping the culture alive, and that culture is a culture which exists in a certain form. So as much as we speak about it going to be about the future, am I not right in saying that part of being indigenous and part of preserving culture is about keeping the past together? That's one. My second question is, which I must ask, is surely, as Marlene put it, that it makes people uncomfortable. I want to go a little bit further. Is it not some sort of a reverse discrimination to say, give me something different or more, for whatever reason, because we were disenfranchised or because of something else, but give me something more just because I have a particular purity in my blood? Because I am Garifuna mixed. I would not be considered, I would consider girl, is that the proper term? but my question is twofold. I don't know who wants to split it up.
Can I tackle that question?
Which part of it?
Wow.
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
all the questions that you're posed are related.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I feel better.
Should we be worried, or should other people be worried?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me say, as indigenous peoples, as black peoples, and you know the Amandala defines black people, if you're not white, you're black, right? Essentially, right? That's what Evan X. Hyde argues.
Yeah.
But other oppressed peoples, we're facing the same monster.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter whether you're Kroll, Mestiz, we're facing the same monster. And in order to understand the current reality, you have to understand history.
Yeah.
Okay? Two things underpin colonialism, and in fact, people don't like to talk about colonialism. And if we talk about colonialism, we shouldn't talk about colonialism as a historical moment, but as a logic, a way of thinking that began there, was established, and kind of went past that. Two things. Many people in Latin America, scholars, talk about coloniality, which is the logic. Is the two things. One is the codification of race, the codification of biological difference into a hierarchy of race. Who is at the top and who is at the bottom. Okay? One.
Yep.
But it's not only the person's knowledge, okay? The person's worldview, the person's way of organizing, the economy, organizing as a people. All of that is denigrated. It's not good. But that's only one thing. The other thing, though, is the subjugation of labor, land, and resources into a global economy to serve no longer local interests, but interests of the global.
That's true.
Those two things, you see the violence that we see in Belize City?
Yep.
That is linked to that. So when the Maya people struggle, they're struggling against that monster. Because a two-headed monster. They're struggling against that. But they're rooting themselves into their cultures. They're rerouting.
Yeah.
They say, what do we have? We have to overcome that racism, and we have to overcome that marginalization. We have to recover that. How do we struggle?
Racism and oppression, though.
Racism and oppression. So racism, as I said, is structural racism. And then I said the loss of the land resources. If you think about slaves, they lost their labor to serve somebody else. Maya people lost their land. So no longer was producing corn, but rather to produce mahogany to export. Okay.
So you'd agree that when we speak about oppression, oppression is not something unique.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Person.
That's right.
It's something
so that's where
people to new immigrants to every Belizean who's oppressed.
Exactly. But now, what are the Maya people doing? And saying, you know what? We have to find strength. How do we struggle? The fact is that all the ways of struggling so far, even right now, people, if you look at the voter turnout, what are people saying? Are they saying, yeah, we should struggle through the political parties? That's not the sound that I hear. All right? So the Maya people have been saying, we have to go back into our own forms of organizing. We have to reroute ourselves, ground ourselves, and we have to reroute ourselves. So it's not only about cultural preservation. And I say it's about creating a space for cultural production. So we're not going to stay the way that we were, but we're going to ground ourselves there and move forward. So in a sense, it's not asking for something different and something special. You're asking for something that is there already, and it's something that we all deserve, to have dignity, right? To have well-being, to be free of discrimination. Right? So to me, we shouldn't be scared of it. We should be inspired by it and say, you know what? Man, if the Maya people are organizing as a community to address their problems, why can't we in Belize City? Why can't we in Corozal? Why can't we in Spanish Lookout, wherever it might be?
Can I ask one more?
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I understand, and I am 100% for indigenous persons. But to answer your question, because you asked the poser question, so I'm going to I'm going to respond, which is why is it different? Because a Creole person in Belize City, or a Hispanic person in Belize City, or an immigrant in Belize City have the same landless issues. But the indigenous persons in Belize have had the benefit of creating a vehicle to secure resources. In the Maya Alliance case, there's been an award of $300,000, which has been put in a trust to develop and to get land issues sorted out. Lands will be carved out for the customary land rights. There's a recent case with the gentleman who was on the Maya ruin down south, correct? And the claim is for $1.something million. Now, no other race in Belize is in fact able to say, because I am Creole, or because they have been killing 150 of the persons in Belize City, that I am directly able to access money from the government. So my question really is, what allows for us to specifically hone in as a country? I think that the group itself is able to do it, but as a country, why should persons who are not indigenous look at it and say the Constitution makes this something that I should feel happy about and support?
I think they can't decide who wants to go first. Pablo.
Very important questions. Just two things first. One, earlier I said that we should be scared of when people are organizing, because I wanted to frame it in the context of what Dr. Penados was saying. Not scared in the sense of being Belizean or the government being scared. Scared because we're now putting our finger on where the problems are, and that's in institutions, mechanisms. It's the continuity of colonialism. That's what we're trying to break. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention to complete my thought earlier. The second is that I think that if we're to take from the lessons of indigenous peoples and throughout the world, and even local communities, the Garifuna, for instance, in Honduras, have been able to utilize now what we consider as global consensus, frameworks that have been established, that have looked at what are the minimum standards to uphold a dignified life. Right? That's partly the function of the United Nations as a body. There's the Organization of American States as well. There are frameworks under that have been teasing out how do we best create a world where people's fundamental rights are upheld. Now, I think that what we can share is we can't expect our governments, in terms of our elected officials, to have all the answers to us, for us. This is about being able to empower our own people, to organize. Nobody can ever stop people in Belize City, whether you're Hispanic or Creole, or throughout the country, to organize. And there are frameworks that, that allows for that organizing. But the first instance is that we must inspire ourselves. We must be able to build that conviction in ourselves as a people first. And it has to start from our family to be able to really take charge of our future.
You know, we pride ourselves as a multicultural society. And I always tell people it's fascinating because, you know, you arrive at the airport, there's a Garifuna musicians there with drums. You will see in perhaps advertisements promoting Belize, you'll see someone in a traditional Mayan outfit, you'll see the Mayan ruins. We are proud of the indigenous cultures and the other cultures in Belize. And we speak so often about cultural preservation, but oftentimes I feel that it is very similar to transparency and accountability. It's lip service because preservation of a culture obviously requires more than just saying, please teach your child how to speak Quechua or Mopan, or please make sure they know how to make hudut and beat the drum. Some of the essential tools that are necessary aren't very often discussed. And from what I'm hearing, it seems to be that it's taking that concept of cultural preservation into perhaps a more tangible action plan or path for the indigenous communities. And with that said, what would you say are some of the priority areas? Because it differs. We haven't even started talking about the differentiation between Yucatec Mayan and Quechua Mayan. We were revising the census. It's 11-point-something% Mayan population in Belize according to the 2010 census. And there's no differentiation between Yucatec or Quechua. Garifuna is at 6-point-something%. So what are some of the priority areas? Obviously, territory, land rights are one part of it, but what are some of the priorities that you see coming together as an indigenous community that needs to be sought to ensure real cultural preservation?
Well, in the case of the Maya is concerned about its land. Now, the Garifuna, on the other hand, is most concerned about its language. Because to the Garifuna, if you don't have a language, you have no culture. Yeah. Because language is the vehicle for our culture. Okay. Now, it's unfortunate that many of the homes are not pushing this. Now, it's even worse in our schools. Yeah. So we need to begin at home and in our schools to teach our cultures, to teach our languages, to teach the value of the land. No,
we know cases in Barranca, for example, where the territorial issue has caused a strain on the livelihood of the Garifuna community there.
That's right.
Where a fishing community feels limited in their access in being able to go. I don't know if the situation is the same as it was when it last reported.
It is still the same and worse.
Yeah.
Because Aston is barely 6 miles away. Ooh. Yeah. And the Guatemalans come over into our waters and take over, fish. Right now, our seas is overfished down in the south. Yeah. Our people can barely catch fish for a living.
Yeah. In the case of the Maya Yucatec in the north, we have a big problem because, like I would say, some people consider themselves indigenous and others like mixture, mestizos. Yeah. So it is really, really one of those big issues that we need to work on. We may not be living traditionally. We may not be living in a thatch house. We may no longer be wearing our huarachas, but we are indigenous. We are blessed. The sugar industry brought a lot of, I would say, advance. And the cañeros have their own land, have their title. Good. But we live in cement houses. People have their ACs in their homes. So one of the big problems is identifying as an indigenous Yucatec person. So this is a big issue. Language is also a problem. Language, our spiritual traditions, it's very limited. Before it was very vibrant, but then colonialism got in there, and religion.
Let's take the moment though, because I don't. This is a great educational lesson for people, because I think of recent we've seen the Yucatec Mayas really organizing themselves, and you have the traditional ball game that you're participating in. The recent efforts of Yasser Musa through SJC to talk about Marcus Canol and make it a name that people are actually aware of, and you pass the monuments within Orange Walk and Corozal, and you start to realize there is a very alive history, I should say, within those territories. But let's talk about just being able to have people understand the differentiation between the Yucatec Maya and the Quechua, and whether or not that is a challenge even internally in being able to make that classification. As I said, our census doesn't separate, and so maybe we could use that as a launching point.
I think in our case, it's quite easy in terms of how we identify ourselves.
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that the Maya nation spans southern Mexico, Guatemala, parts of Honduras. There's over 20 different groups of Mayas. Clearly, one language distinguishes us, and through some of our cultural attires and patterns, mostly it's mostly the patterns that really distinguishes the different groups, and some variation of our spirituality as well. But I don't think it's difficult to differentiate amongst ourselves who is Mopan, who is Quechua, and who is Yucatec. I think the greatest challenge that we see is people being able to identify as a Maya, but mostly in the western and northern part of the country, because of, as Ms. Canol mentioned, there's that Antun. There's that the evolution of the communities there is such that there's a lot of modern interactions going on. So that might be a bit of the challenge.
Is this a case of, because Ms. Antun, I was listening to you in terms of saying that you're not living traditionally. So you have the ACs, you have the cement houses, but is a case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too, because the whole basis of saying, part of the basis of saying that we're indigenous people and that we deserve to be valued and preserved and to have that base of strength is that we have this traditional bond. But if the people are not living that way, then is it an issue of what is the purpose?
Let me continue.
Miss Canton says she's ready. She can handle it.
In our case, in Orange Walk, it's not that we do not want to live traditionally. You go around Orange Walk, you cannot find the materials to build your traditional houses, your homes.
And young people wouldn't want to live in.
But we want Facebook does include cement or AC.
Absolutely.
Now I was going to say that you remind me of a conversation we were having when our company was down south, and one of their esteemed liars said, "You know what the Maya people want? They only want a piece of the pie, man. Just give them a percentage of the revenues collected from the oil."
That's insulting.
I think that this is part of what we were talking about in terms of the colonial past still holding on us as Belizeans. What we hear from our communities, what do we want? We want to be peaceful. We want to be collective. We want to be hardworking. We want to be able to live with our environment. We want to be able to create opportunities out of our cultural and natural heritage. So it's not just about the material part of things. And this frame, I think, goes bigger in terms of the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the national development of Belize. I always make the criticism that indigenous peoples are often included, and I will extend it to local communities, are always included in the approach of Belize in terms of development from a livelihood approach, where I'll give you 2 more cacao trees, man, so you can plant more, you have an extra buck in your pocket, you'll do well. Yeah. We already know that doesn't work. Does that contribute to the peace we're talking about? Does that contribute to the collectiveness we're talking about? It doesn't. In fact, it creates the breakdown in what we see in other parts of the country right now. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it is okay to be able to have an AC in your room. I always say, look,
absolutely.
I always say, look at the iPhones. Where does the material for that come from? It comes from some indigenous people's land that are dying actually to extract it to sell it. So now you're telling me they don't deserve enjoying that. They should, they rightfully should. It comes from their land.
Absolutely.
There are a couple of things that are very important. One, I think that there are fundamental values and principles that we ought to hold on to, in what Filiberto calls it, rerouting ourselves, to engage and to contend with the challenges we face now.
And I think that was really an excellent point in being able to understand that you don't necessarily want to be stuck in the past. You simply want to be established, to have an established presence to continue moving forward. I want to touch on an issue, and I really don't want us to run out of time, and the issue is discrimination. Because we don't talk about it enough. We talk about cultures and how much we love it, and we love our 90th holiday, and you know, all the other traditional foods and the great parts. But there is discrimination in this country, and I think it was very evident with the issues with the Garifuna culture. We saw the issues in Stan Creek with the bank worker.
That's right.
And we also saw the issues within the union.
Yeah.
We saw when there was the court case going on that there were very clear clashes. And as I said, derogatory statements made regarding the Maya for wanting to claim land. Talk to us about how you feel BENIC, this indigenous group, can be able to help to bring this issue to the forefront.
At least I think we'll be able to speak with one voice. Very, very important. When BENIC speaks, it speaks for the indigenous people of Belize. Very, very critical. Yeah. Yes. And collectively we can address these issues of discrimination.
Yeah.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, well, one, I think we have to overcome, let me call it internal discrimination. What I mean by internal discrimination, I mean like that we discriminate our own self, when we deny, when we reject our own ways of knowing and being. Right? I will see our parents, okay, sometimes, or we as parents might use statements that denigrate whether you are indigenous or whether you're black, okay? And in Spanish, we say, pareces indio, no sabes de cosa buena. Okay? You're like an Indian, you know anything.
You don't know better, yeah.
So that's we have internalized that discrimination. We have to work on that. And of course, we have to work against structural racism, structural discrimination. And that, I think, is really important. Of course, I think there's discrimination among people, okay? And that needs to be worked at as well. But I think the one that is more worrying for me is the structural one, okay? Structural racism, okay? For example, if you think about a child that goes to school, right? In some community, let's say a Creole community, they speak Creole all their life, and Creole as a language, right? You go there to school, and nothing in the school that is taught in that curriculum reflects you or your culture. What is it telling you about yourself? Same with Garifuna. Okay, so you talk about, yes, you're multicultural. Oh, it's great, you know, come tourists, come check, and eat the hudot, and come eat the caldo and that. But really, do we embrace that? What does multiculturalism really mean at a deeper sense? And so we would like to go at a deeper sense, and not to divide people. No, we are different. There's no doubt about it. Exactly. Okay, but we're all, as I said, we're facing the same monster, and we are collectively responsible for this piece of land we call Belize. The task is, how do we come together?
Can I ask a very cynical question? And I know somebody out there is thinking this, so I have to ask it. What if somebody out there cynically is thinking, listen, the Mayan persons in Belize have been under fire in terms of the race issue. People are saying, you know, the Mayans want things that other Belizeans don't want. We should all want the same thing. And so strategically, to deal with that race aspect, that there's a marketing tool to include the Garifuna now as indigenous people to try to deal with some of the backlash. To say it's not just Maya people, but it's also persons of color. So what if people were to challenge and say, listen, the only reason that we have Benik is because we're trying to offset the criticism that we probably would have as Mayans to include our Garifuna brothers?
You know, that's a very good question. And I think as we walked in, Mr. Cayetano was talking about Mr. Austin Flores, right? Who was there in the early 1990s, and I wasn't there, at the establishment of the Belize National Indigenous Council, right? So the Garifuna were there from the beginning.
Exactly.
If you look at Guatemala, okay?
They dropped off though, a little.
Well, they might have, no, they've never been off.
This is a rejuvenation of
yes. So yes.
I mean, there was a lull.
Yes, a lull.
But include the
It's a
Garifuna.
responsibility for all of
Yes,
the
so they
all of the
dropped
Mayan
off.
Garifuna. If you look in Guatemala, okay, it's the same kind of thing, right? You have the Garifuna people being members of it. But there's one thing very important, I think, to what you're saying. If there's one thing that the British are very successful, is to use divisions.
Yeah.
So people say, divide and conquer. Right? So to me, that cynicism is that the question could suffer, right, from that. Okay, I mean, if we allow that to divide us, okay, then we're not going to be able to solve our problems as indigenous peoples, and neither will we be able to address the very question of discrimination and address the questions of Belize as a whole. Right.
So I think that one of the things that Kevin pointed out was obviously looking at some of the questions and criticisms that people may have. And one of the first will be, is this simply an attempt to get resources as indigenous people?
Good. I don't know. I mean, I want to tackle the question, but I don't want to take over. I've been talking a lot. All right?
I was hoping you were going to tell the story that we had just a while ago with
yeah, I mean, people say, well, where will you find the money for this? And I was saying, we haven't talked about money, okay? It's not about money. And I was saying, of course you need money to do stuff, but let me tell you how money works, okay? I said, you know, you are in some community, and some funder comes and says, do you want some funding? Organize yourself, we have money for raising pigs. Okay? So you begin to raise pigs, right? Another funder comes and says, hey, we have money to grow chickens. Organize yourself and we'll give you money to grow chickens. And so you do the same. They sell the money to do the thing that you want to do.
Never.
But not just money. I mean, being able to access land. For example, if we start to see there's a clamor for perhaps rights to land within an area in Toledo for the Garifuna community, for the Yucatec community, wherever in other parts of the country, that makes people a bit nervous. And especially in a time where land ownership is very limited for Belizeans in general, whether you're of an indigenous community or not.
Yes, I know. I mean, it's very rare. There's been a lot on the news where people have been given land and then the government has to pay money. You know, I mean, the land is a very important question.
Very important.
But it's not about that. As I said, you asked me talking about cultural preservation and so on. And one thing that I emphasized earlier was that indigenous people struggle for a space for cultural production. It's not about preserving culture, but how do we tackle this two-headed monster? That's what it is about, okay? Yes, and the same thing for the Creole and they're facing the same thing. How do you organize to do that? So sometimes we say, you know, Belize as a nation is in the process of construction, right? And so coming together and tackling those issues is very important.
You know, there's one thing I'd like to ask, as the only female on set. You know, the perception is that the Maya culture, I was a prosecutor down south for about a year, and we had difficulties with the culture sometimes in terms of prosecuting certain cases, certain sexual offense cases. I know that the Garifuna community is a very strong machismo society. I was wondering, yes, very patriarchal. I was wondering how it is that indigenous people, and particularly as it relates to women's issues, we're in Women's Month, if there is a fight between the way culturally women are seen in these indigenous groups, because I'm sure that it's not the liberated sort of short pants wearing, bend over, touch your toe sort of society that we have now and tolerate now. How is that fight between women are seen traditionally in both the Garifuna culture and in the man culture, and where it will go in the future?
Before, years ahead when I was young, I can say that also the Mayas were very possessive. They were very machos then.
Yeah.
They were the one who had the first and the last word.
The men?
The men. And the women were quite humble. They were quite submissive. They were, if they say sit there, you sit there. If they say speak, you speak. However, nowadays we do have, for example, this is an indigenous person and he's a doctor. So also in the north we have our indigenous, not only men but also women who have already climbed up the ladder. So now the men cannot say wear red.
Yeah.
I will wear my white if I want to wear my white.
Yeah.
So it has really changed. It has really changed. But again, it's the women who have this, I would say, the reins to our culture. Because even though nowadays men and women work, but I still feel like some men still have this machismo, because even though two of us work, I go out 5 o'clock and come back 7 o'clock, and when I come, you still expect me
to make tea.
To hurry prepare, and then not only prepare it but also serve it to you.
It's part of the culture.
So it's part of the culture. So I think we really have to work on this dialogue. This has to come within the family.
But wouldn't the argument be then that it's going against your culture?
No. The culture has to change, man. The culture changes.
Culture changes. Yeah, we also have to recognize that I think that some of these practices, I think, if you look at what we're talking about here, cuts across.
Yeah.
It's beyond.
This is beyond the indigenous cultures. I have to say that.
And we recognize that there are institutions that actually tries to reinforce that. For instance, in churches, there are some churches where men sit on one side, the women have to sit on the other side.
Or one to the front and one to the back.
So part of so we have to address these things in the work we do. And if you look at the Alcalde system, for instance, it has now included women can run for office. And we've been trying to create that space. We've been trying to also connect again, for instance, laws that looks at the protection of women and children in particular. Connecting the institutions that are established with communities, because to a large extent, sometimes it is the access to those institutions, to the existing laws, that becomes the barriers. So just to say that there is, I think, a lot of work that's needed in that area within our communities, but Belize on a whole. If you look at Benic, for instance, in the reconstitution, we're trying to look at what can we learn from the past, the new policies that each cultural group needs to bring forward a representative, a women representative, a young people representative, a spiritual representative from the different linguistic groups. Young people, we're reaching out to the National University because they do have clubs. We want them to be a part of this process as well. So I think there is need to constantly be reassessing where we are. If we are, again, I go back to the point, if we're going to have a chance at contending with these challenges, these global challenges that we have, the challenges of women, and gender equality is a global challenge, and I think we have an opportunity to do things differently here.
You know, I'm glad you touched on the young people issue, because I think that's one of the things that has been going through my mind throughout this conversation. Are young people interested in maintaining cultural practices and traditions? Do you have them on board at this point in time? Or are they more interested in assimilating into the wider culture of a Belizean?
And Marlene, in some ways, we have lost our youth. And talking about the Garifuna culture, we have lost some of our youths. And because of the loss of our youths, they have embraced other culture. And in that process, many of our youths leave our villages, come to the city, have no skills, so they find themselves in gangs.
Yeah.
And this is a very, very sad situation.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know. Those we have, we are working with them. But
let me just get in a question here. How will the formulation of Beni, and I know because other cultures will have the same issue, and it's not just about wanting to fit in within Belize. Many of our young people have North American aspirations because of what we see on TV and social media. But how will Beni help in being able to not just preserve those of you, you're not old, but you have been working in this particular area for a while, but you have the younger generation coming up. How will they be involved? Because you will eventually need them to be able to carry on with the work that you establish.
that's right.
Absolutely. But as I said, Pablo has explained that in the new structure, right? First of all, we're saying young people need to be part of this structure.
Yeah.
So there's that, okay, definitely. And that is there to make sure that the indigenous voice is heard, right? And yes, part of the process also is to help them, in a sense, to also decolonialize ourselves, because I said you kind of see your own knowledge as not being important. So how do we make our young people see that as a value?
Yeah.
It's okay if they go to the US, you know.
Yeah.
It's okay if they go to the UK. It's okay if they use a computer and have a cell phone. All of that is part of their world. But they have to be involved in terms of shaping their future. Yeah. So one last thing. I'm inspired because I see young people. I was invited recently to an event at the University of Belize. And these are Maya young people who organized to have an event to celebrate Mother Languages Day. Right? And they see the importance of language. And I was there emphasizing, but it's not only about speaking the language. Okay, you know, I don't speak my language, I'm trying to learn it. But it's not only the language because it's beautiful, but because it reflects a certain way of thinking. And my challenge to them was, how can we develop a social science? How can we develop a humanities that is based on our own knowledge? And that, I think, can excite young people. So they don't see that going to the US means that, you know, or do they have to wear your attire in order to be indigenous? That's not it.
Yeah. Looking the part doesn't make you fulfill the part. Now, I have one, and we're really out of time, so we need a quick answer to this one, but it's a burning question.
Let Pablo answer it.
No, it's a burning question, because let's look specifically at the Mayans in the South. We're talking about being able to preserve a way of life, about ensuring that you are fighting for the rights and equality of indigenous people. You spoke of the poverty rate and what is typically classified. Toledo is the poorest country. And in fact, having worked in Mayan communities, you know, I think one of the things that don't necessarily match up is the classification for poverty and the understanding of how people live. What do you say to people if you're talking about preserving a way of life that by international standards and Belize standards are saying that's poverty? You don't have particular things in place that qualify for you to be above the poverty level. How are you talking about progressing when the view of a traditional way of life is seen as substandard?
I think we touched a little bit on it earlier, that there is a need to look at the institutions that are in place. I mean, but there's a lot of hope. I mean, Gulisi is a very good example of where you have, I can only imagine those young people, those children, when they become young adults, their way of thinking, their way of relating to modern life and the world is going to be from a different perspective. And I think there's more of that's needed, not only in the area of education. We recently were talking with national efforts in the conservation of biodiversity. Often protected areas, we fence and we police, we protect everything else.
Yeah.
And but yet globally, the challenge is that protected areas are failing, and much of the green remains in indigenous peoples and local communities' territories. So now there's a shift. Then I know in Belize they're going to be looking at the Forest Act. So there's a need for indigenous people, local communities to be a part of that. There are big initiatives like the Red Plus, that the Key Biodiversity Areas Project, that has actually a requirement. The World Bank, whose funding, has an indigenous peoples policy that requires indigenous peoples to be a part of creating the policies, creating the regulations that will be essential to have successful biodiversity protection. Is that happening? It's not happening. So we're saying here, we need to, this is high time for all of us to come together and begin to look at all these different areas for more economic policy, environmental policy, biodiversity, climate change. So there's lots of spaces that we need to see the visibility of indigenous peoples becoming present.
My final question is, I mean, we've seen progress in terms of indigenous people in Belize. Surely legally we've seen where there's a decisive decision recognizing Maya land rights. We have, in terms of the social space, we have seen where, and political space, we've seen where we've had Maya ministers, we've had significant Garifuna ministers, female Garifuna ministers, and lawyers. We have lawyers here. So there has been progress. Clearly, with the amalgamation of BENIC, there is a need for more, apparently. That there is a call that we can do more, and we can do more by coming together.
Exactly.
My question is a little bit more fundamental. The problem appears to be, when I hear my peers speak about it, their contention is normally the question of, as Marlene put it, the issue of resources. That somehow there is this belief that there is an organization designed to find a way to extract resources from the state. And so the criticism is, why is it that the state should give resources specifically to this group when all of the issues that you're speaking about affect Belizeans generally? The question is, as it relates to indigenous people, could the most cynical person in Belize say, well, scientifically, these groups aren't really indigenous to Belize. They're indigenous people, but they're not indigenous people to Belize. And I heard it repeated in probably an insulting way in a court case. But indigenous to Belize, the Garifuna, if my social history is correct, are not necessarily indigenous to Belize.
Or indigenous to the Caribbean.
They're Caribbean to the Caribbean.
Is part of Belize.
But when we're talking about resources to be distributed in Belize, the Garifuna would not necessarily qualify to be indigenous to Belize.
Why not?
Because as my history says,
we've been here over 200 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. But so have the slaves that came as well. But they weren't First Nation people to Belize.
But to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean is a part of Belize.
Yes, but the challenge, Mr. Caetano, is not giving resources from the Caribbean. The challenge is giving resources from the Belize government and the Belizean people. And just to tidy up the point quickly, and in relation to the Mayan people, and although it was said in a very insulting way, which I am embarrassed that it was put in that way, but only point scientifically, I think the number is almost less than 1% of the Maya who currently live in Belize were originally in Belize as First Nation persons. So if we look at it in detail, they're not necessarily indigenous to Belize.
Two things. You're cutting a double bind, okay? You're cutting a double bind. Okay. Say, for example, I am from Sokots.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, the people from Tipu, okay, along the
Tipu?
Makal River, were shipped out to Peten. Okay?
Yes.
They were pushed out to Peten.
Yes.
So, let's say, for example, my great-grandfather was there, just hypothetically. He's shipped there. And then, you know, my grandfather comes back. And you're telling me, but you know what? You don't belong here.
No, man, he's indigenous to that place. He was there originally. He was shipped
But
away.
isn't that, but exactly. So how do we know? Okay?
Well,
How
it's
do
just
you
a science.
No,
eh?
but that's what I'm saying. So that's what I'm saying, so you realize it. Then the last thing I wanted to say, the question about resources.
Yeah.
You know, I find it funny because, and I go back, who is the real enemy? That would be my response. Because think about it. So the Maya people in Toledo are struggling for land. And I am in Sokots, right? Or Kai or Belize City. And I say, but how could the Maya people get land? You mean I can't get no piece of land at Toledo? There's no fair, man. Why should they get more land? I'll tell you something. Let's say the government decided, you know what? Toledo is free for all. You think the person in some south side Belize City is going to get a piece of land in Toledo?
Probably not.
Who will get the land?
The 2% rich of the world.
There you go.
Everything.
So
2%,
there you go.
Belize won.
Yeah. All right, so there you go. There you go. Okay? But yet, you know, that person in the street, he says, yeah, the Maya should not get land. They don't realize that the two-headed monster is really the enemy.
Yeah.
They're fighting their brother,
Yeah,
who is trying to secure a piece of land for himself. So who is the real enemy? Let's fight that.
And I think that is the perfect close for the conversation that would leave us all thinking. Thank you. Obviously, we had to be your worst critics, but we are also very enthused to see the amalgamation of the Belize, or the reestablishment, sorry, of the Belize National Indigenous Council. And of course, we expect to hear more from you. And from what I've read from your press release, it's not just about speaking of issues affecting Indigenous people, but issues affecting Belizeans in general.
You know, sorry, Marlene. You know, Mr. Caetano.
Yes, so,
Yes,
oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And speaking of that, we know that there is a release that you wanted to share with us on behalf of the Garifuna Council.
Yes. Now, on behalf of the National Garifuna Council of Belize, I wish to condemn the upsurge of violence in Belize, especially the recent rape and murder of 17-month-old Alisa Nunez, the murder of the 2 Maya women, sisters in San Jose, Toledo, the rape and molestation of the 4-year-old and 11-year-old sisters of Bella Vista, and the hideous murder of these 3 women in their homes in Belize City. Crimes against girls and women must stop. The perpetrators must be caught and brought to justice. Thanks from NGC.
And thank you for sharing that. And thank you for such an interesting conversation to start off for Tuesday morning. We appreciate it, and best of luck. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we're shifting gears. We're thinking about the holiday that's coming up, and most importantly, we're helping you find those deals. That's coming up after the break, so stay tuned.